Hi, good morning. I'm Patricia Albacete, and before I start with the presentation, I would like to give thanks to Kurt Van Leen, who was my dissertation advisor, and also to Alan Leskold, Sandy Katz, and Bruce Buchanan, who were on my dissertation committee, for all their support and encouragement and guidance throughout my years as an ISP student, which involved having two babies in between, so it was kind of challenging. But now, back to my topic, since I only have 5 minutes. Natural language interaction in education. This is a topic that is avoided by many developers of intelligent tutoring systems because of its potential complexity. And to illustrate, we'll look at a few examples. In the first one on the left, there is two students solving a simple algebra problem. They get stuck, and their interaction, as you see, is very concise, personalized, and very effective. But from a natural language interaction point of view, is not particularly complex. If we look at our second example, this is a very familiar situation. In a history class, the teacher is giving a lesson and then presents a simple question. Well, he gets a whole array of different answers, from the student that is really confused and lost, to the one that is overgeneralizing, to the one that really is on point and knows the solution, and to the one in red who, as you see, is completely off topic. And as you can see, the language interaction here has the potential to be extremely complex because we have many participants and they all have different knowledge levels. So many times the teachers, to avoid this complexity, they just go on with the right answer and continue with the lesson. But this leaves many of the students with their needs not met. So that leads us to our third example, which is a tutor discussing a conceptual problem with a student. The problem that the tutor is presenting, I don't know if you are able to read that, but anyway, it's just going in a circle, and there is this is a physics problem. You're going in a circle, and you have a net force applied to you that is directed toward the center of the circle. But then why don't we move toward the center of the circle? I don't know if any one of you would know how to answer this question, but this is what would be considered a deep problem. And the reason it's considered a deep problem is that the student needs to bring to bear a large amount of knowledge to be able to solve this problem. And not only that, they need to weave it into a coherent line of reasoning. As it's often the case, the student has very, their knowledge is incoherent, is sometimes has mistakes in it, and they're not able to produce a coherent explanation. But in spite of this, the human tutor is able to pick up the bits of pieces that the student says in their explanation and encourage the student and address their misconceptions, and guide them through a dialogue that will lead to the correct solution. Now, tutoring systems to date have mostly focused on this kind of problems. They are mostly dealing with procedural knowledge, and they're very challenging to develop, like just express, but they don't have much of natural language interaction. Now, we are interested in developing intelligent tutoring systems that deal with these kinds of problems. Now, they present some very unique challenges. The first one, of course, is how do we understand these long, open-ended answers that the students gave. This is going way beyond what our electronic friends, Siri, Alexa, or Watson can understand, as these Sunday comic shows. This is very important for two reasons that we are able to understand the student answers. The first one is because when the system doesn't understand what the student is saying, the student disengages and gets very frustrated, two things that we don't want. And the second one is because eventually what we do want to have is a tutoring system that doesn't tell the student, hey, this is what I want to teach you. It's more mimicking what tutor would do during office hours. That is, have the student come with their concerns, with their questions, with their misunderstandings. So we need a system that can understand them. The second big challenge is how do we scale up? What we have done so far in our research is hand author a group of dialogues that address conceptual issues and test them in the lab. We have been able to scale that up so that it can be tested in a classroom and cover about a week of students' work. But we would like to have the system be in a classroom for a whole semester. That is something that you just cannot hand author. So we need to find ways of doing this automatically. And the third big challenge, which is more of has a cognitive flavor to it, is we know that what is important is the interaction, but what is specifically about the interaction that is effective? And so we're trying to mine the different teaching strategies that tutors use, and also to see how they are personalizing their dialogue to each student for the current step and through time. So our research efforts have focused on this third challenge, and now Pam Jordan will give you an overview of what we have been doing.
Okay, so what we did to address this is work that we've been doing in the last 10 years with Sandy Katz. And what we did first was take a corpus of human-human tutorial dialogues that she had available, and we annotated them manually for informational relations just between the tutor-student pairs and the student-tutor pairs, too. So then we said, well, which of these informational relations correlate with learning? And so we would then take those that correlated with learning and then go back in manually and say, well, what are the contexts in which these particular informational relations are mostly appearing? And we'll set that up as a guideline for this manual authoring that we're doing. So in this example, we found that the context was that there's an incorrect answer, and they're going into remediation, and the student starts to show some understanding of the topic. So that what the human tutors were doing were kind of skipping along and just telling them the rest of it once they showed some understanding. So then we can translate that over to the tutoring system, and when it detects that they are in a remediation and then have started to make some progress in it, then it just skips over and tells the rest of the line of the reasoning. So we came up with 8 guidelines like this. So we hand-authored. Basically, you can think of it as a finite state machine where the tutor turn is the state, and the classifications of the students' responses are the arcs that lead to the next state for the tutoring system. And here I'm illustrating, so on your left is the right answer, a partially correct, no, that's the partially correct answer, then the right answer, a very not specific enough answer, and then an incorrect answer. And so then we took all of those dialogues. We had 2 versions that we wrote. First, we wrote the version without the guidelines, and then we wrote a version where we did apply those guidelines. And we took it into we put it into our system, where students would do homework, and then they would come to the system and they would get a worked example video of that problem in case they didn't do their homework. And then we would have a discussion with them reflect on some of the concepts involved in that. So here you can see the green arrow pointing towards where they said something right, and the system reacts to that. Yellows that were partially correct, and so it supplies some additional information, and then finally where it's wrong and it has to remediate. So we had some nice results from that. So compared the students using the system that had those 8 guidelines incorporated into the dialogues learned significantly more than the students that were working with the version of the system where those guidelines weren't purposely put in. And furthermore, we found that, for some reason, the female students learned more from this than the male students. So that was great, but the students had a lot of complaints about the system. And it took a lot of time for them to get through the dialogues, and there was a lot of repetition. So we said, well, what can we do to make this more acceptable? So let's try first adapting the step size based on their pretest score, because we didn't have any student modeling in place in the system at all. And so I'll have to look up here because I can't see that small print. So we start off with a question, and this is a very supported question. And the student answers, and then we have to make a decision about, are we going to go through the background reasoning behind that, or are we just going to skip over to the next step? So you might want to go through that with a student who you don't think knows that material very well. But if you've got a student that seems to know this part pretty well, but you want to move on to something they don't know very well, then you can just skip on to the next step. So that was what we were aiming for. And so we wanted to see if we could save time for the students, but not interfere with their learning. And we were successful at that. The high knowledge students took significantly less time in the condition where we had that adaptation versus just talking through everything with them. So we wanted to go even further. We said, well, how else can we adapt the dialogue? And so we said, well, let's look at adapting the hints and also incorporate a student model so that we have the student's progress throughout the dialogue being reflected in our decision making. And this is work that we're currently doing with Bruce McLaren. And so there the idea is that, well, you start out with a more supported statement to the student and a less supported statement. So you would do the advanced student the less advanced student this way, and the more advanced student that way. And they, hopefully come up with the right answer. So we're trying to predict which one they'll be more likely to be able to answer, but constrain as much as possible the amount of information or help that we're giving them. And so then it just progresses on through that. So I wanted to recognize Min Chi because we're using instructional factors model, which is some work that she did as a postdoc. And it's a logistic regression model that tracks the concepts you're exposed to and your correctness on those concepts and incorrectness. And then we also update after every student tutor turn. And we're in the classrooms right now testing that, so I can't tell you any results on that. And a little bit on the future of natural language processing in education. It's not just tutoring. There's grading short answers like they do at ETS. There's giving students feedback on writing, which is one of the areas that Diane was working in. And so there's a lot, in second language acquisition, you can give people feedback on their grammar. So as far as the natural language interaction, we want to be able to assess the student's progress from what he says. So there's a lot that a student can tell you, not just from their actions, but what they can tell you that can give you some more insight. We want to provide, maybe this could be an alternative to being a more active way to engage a student with new material that they're trying to learn. And then of course, providing a better understanding of what support to give and when. And so that kind of ties in with some of Min's work. And while she's coming up and setting up, I want to thank my dissertation advisor, Rich, and one of my committee members is here, Martha. You remember being on my committee? Thank you for influencing what I learned. And then I stayed around. I was sort of like the adult ISP child that hung out in the ISP basement. And I worked with Kurt Van Lane. And I went from being started as computer science, computational linguistics, and now I'm not sure what label to give myself, but somebody who's interested in cognition and language. So that's it. Oh, and then I also wanted to thank all the students that I learned from too as well, because I got to interact with some of the graduate students that followed on, and that was a great experience.
I don't know if anybody have any questions. 2 minutes for questions. So, Karen.
When you showed a slide of your system in the classroom, is it really in the real classroom with all that noise and speech and stuff?
Well, it's all typed.
Yeah.
That's how we get around it.
Yeah, they have usually, headphones, and we are
With the
trying.
video.
Yeah, and we are trying to do it so that they can. These are homework problems.
And they can also do it at home as well.
Yeah. But it's better if they do it in class because they actually use the system more, as you well know. Probably. Okay, so I think we can pass on to me, and thank you.